Hello, I'm Sarah Rose Graber, and I was a circumnavigator in 2004. And my topic was all about how a theater for social change was being used around the world. So I was looking at different problems and issues that existed in different countries and how theater was being used as a tool to create change in a positive way for those communities. The Chicago Circumnavigator chapter was the one that sponsored me on my circumnavigation scholarship. I studied at Northwestern University, which is where I got my degree in theater and did my thesis in performance studies. Started off in the UK, and then I went down to South Africa. Then I was in Kenya, Mauritius, Australia, both Western Australia and then New South Wales. And then I was in New Zealand and Argentina and then back over to Chicago. I loved my experience in the UK. It was a fantastic opportunity to come to a country that had such a rich and robust theater community already. So, with my research being all about theater for social change, there was such an incredible infrastructure already embedded into the industry. So, I learned a lot about really progressive techniques of using theater as a tool for education in a lot of school settings and working with a lot of at risk youth. In South Africa, they have one of the largest arts festivals for all of Africa that occurs every summer in Grahamstown. And so I attended the uh, amazing theater festival that was happening and got a chance to see theater performances from all over Africa in that one location. And it was incredible being in South Africa. The culture there was very different from what I had expected. Again, this was in 2004, so it was really not all that long since apartheid had ended in the time that I was there. And a lot of the books I was reading at that time were really sort of going on about how, with apartheid being over, there was equality now, and it was free for both Black populations to be able to live a free life along with the white populations. And then, of course, being there on the ground, which many circumnavigators have experienced, you see things with your own eyes. And it became very sobering to have a very stark realization about what that meant for these Black communities that were still living in corrugated iron sort of huts and living with very little means, not having access to education, and therefore unemployment and the struggles of what happened as a result of moving forward out of apartheid. So it was a really eye opening experience to be immersed in that culture. My time in Kenya was a very eye opening experience as well, getting the chance to learn about all of the different challenges that are presented in that country, specifically the health crisis that was happening at that time in relation to the AIDS pandemic. A huge portion of the population had AIDS or HIV. And because it used to cost money to get an education in Kenya, there was very low rates of literacy. And so people who are contracting this uh, condition, this virus, were being handed pamphlets about information as to how to protect themselves. And of course, that wasn't going to be useful. And so theater was playing a massively important role of going into spaces like Kibera slums, where I got to spend some time uh, being able to do performances where it was creating these situations that became ways for the audiences to observe what was happening and to empathize with these characters, but also using something called forum theater, which is a style of theater performance that empowers audience members to actually step into the protagonist role and get uh, be part of the solution finding to figure out what was going to be the best way to fix something. So it became a very experiential learning opportunity for those audiences to improve their experience with how to deal with this health crisis. Um, but in reference to my blog in Kenya, I had to, of course, update my circumnavigator blog as I was going around the world. And at that time, that was the main form of communication between myself and the people back in the US, the Chicago chapter that was responsible for my well being and, of course, my family. And while I was there, I was often in very remote locations. I'd gone to visit the Maasai tribes and learn a little bit more about their performative techniques in terms of their own rituals and practices, and was not always able to access electricity, let alone internet. So I would have to wait really, really long hours in the uh, internet cafes trying to get on the computer. And I remember specifically one moment of having to wait 2 hours. And there was a guy who was literally watching porn in the internet cafe while we were waiting to have our chance to get on the computers to be able to update people and let them know I was okay. That was probably the longest stint I had gone without writing in the blog because I just didn't have access to a computer. So everyone was very glad to see that post, and I was certainly very glad to finally be sitting at that computer. Mauritius is a fascinating country, and in the time that I was there, they were having a huge boom in terms of their tourism industry at that time, which was a big push from the government to turn it into more of a tropical paradise for people to come and visit, especially Europeans to head over and yeah, enjoy the white sand beaches and crystal clear waters. But of course, what that did as well was took a lot of the native population and moved it towards the uh, outskirts of some of those more picturesque locations. And there's a real rich history of the slave trades that were going through there, in terms of slaves being shipped between Africa and off to Europe and whatnot. And there's a very sort of deep history connected to Sega dancing and just a real sense of storytelling as part of their culture. So performance became a real way of kind of honing on to that culture, and being able to see firsthand that polarity between the very wealthy areas filled with tourists and the locals that were working on sugarcane farms and making rum, which were very popular items that come from that country. It was an a fascinating experience to learn about how those two sit side by side. And of course, Mauritius is often known for being the place where the dodo bird lived, and of course is now extinct. So the kind of claim to fame of this country sitting alongside the complexity of trying to grow and develop a nation while also having a responsibility to the people that live there and are local. In Australia, I had the opportunity to meet up with another circumnavigator, actually, Paolo Valcini, who was a member of, I think, the Singapore Club, actually. But he and his wife, Jennifer, own a place in Western Australia in Perth. And so they were very, very kind and welcomed me. And I was able to stay with them in my time there. And there was something so wonderful about what happens with the Circumnavigators Club, where it suddenly makes the world feel small when you have people in different places and shared experiences. So even though you don't know one another and you're ultimately strangers, you have this experience that's so unique to only a certain amount of people that you instantly relate to one another in a way that's really wonderful. And so staying with Paolo and Jennifer was an incredible way of experiencing Perth in Australia for the first time, because you got that local experience instead of just showing up as the dirty backpacker kid trying to find my way around and staying in hostels, which was incredibly enriching just as a cultural experience and a fun experience. But to then have someone who knew all of the like cool restaurants and the great sights to see, and having someone who had a car and actually being able to zip around was really a luxury that was very different from some of my other stays where I, met lovely people, but there was something that felt very different about actually being hosted in a really lovely way. And then, of course, heading over to New South Wales on the other coast, I spent most of my time in Sydney and then was also in Canberra. And the theater community there is just massive. There's so much going on in terms of arts and culture, and a very young population that was there at that time. So it was an exciting place to be, with loads of performances happening and cultural events taking place everywhere. But of course, that sits alongside a real collision with the Aboriginal culture as well, that there's Aboriginal populations that have basically, been erased from the history books for so many years. And so theater was becoming a really important tool of bridging that gap between these cultures and sort of bringing back the importance of the history of these communities that had been sort of pushed aside. New Zealand was a lovely experience. It's such a beautiful country, and I found the people there to be so welcoming and warm and friendly, and had the opportunity to travel all around the North Island and spent a good portion of my research actually working with some of the Maori tribes, which was a fascinating experience because they don't have a written language. And so their history and culture was all done through oral traditions and storytelling, which of course is essential and central to theater making. We find compelling stories that engage audiences and have them recognize things in different characters. And that's what they intrinsically are doing in the Maori tribes, of being able to share their history and their stories. So it was a really special experience to learn more about their connection to the land and where they come from in terms of their family dynamics and how that plays into how they tell their stories. And a really moving way of the power of theater and the theatrics that are involved in how we tell our own stories. That was a really wonderful connection for me as a young artist and young researcher going around the world and trying to figure out what were the important pieces in this work that were going to be part of how I continued to share what I learned back in the States and beyond with every place that I was going to after that. Argentina is such a political place already, in the sense that you have, Eva Peron, and there's all this history with uh, a very passionate culture that was beautiful to see in person, these kind of iconic locations, and knowing that rich history of yeah, just the kind of wild politics that have existed in that country, and being there. Uh, yeah, I learned loads. At the time I was there, there was quite a bit of corruption that was happening in the government that had to do with unemployment, and people at the time really struggling with getting access to work opportunities. And so there were protests that were happening on the street in my time there. I had gone thinking I was going to spend most of my time at their arts center and with the different theater companies. And instead, I found the most impactful takeaway from that experience was actually looking at the protesters in the streets, who were making these massive signs and giving these proclamations that were incredibly theatrical. And one moment that really stuck out to me, where there was a protester that had created this kind of puppet of one of the politicians in Buenos Aires. And it was one of those like big wearable puppets. So it was like on his shoulders, this like head. And then he had these rods for like the big hands of the puppet. And a police officer that was trying to address the crowd and ensure that there was calm and order started yelling at the puppet and not at the man, because there was something so just alive and activated about this massive thing coming at it and at him. And that idea of how art is so effective and impactful, because when we see things like that, when we see how people are engaging with it, it really shows us a lot about how it's affecting those who are listening. Yeah, it was a really passionate culture, I found. I mean, obviously you have the history of uh, tango dancing and flamenco dancing, excuse me, and just this idea of this culture that's always been, they're quite a verbal culture, I found, very animated and activated when they talk and communicate, and lovers of like good food and good wine. And to see them when they're frustrated by something, it just is part of how they communicate their thoughts. Um, yeah. I really enjoyed it, especially as a backpacker where you're going off of these tiny budgets that we were given. And I don't know if the price has gone up since 2004. I hope it has, because I know certainly when I went, I was on a shoestring for sure. But I remember having gone to, I was coming, from New Zealand, but then showing up in Argentina, I felt like a queen. I was staying in a hostel where I think I paid something like the equivalent of $6 a night to stay in this like really lovely hostel that gave me breakfast and gave me like free dance lessons. And then I would have the equivalent of like, yeah, I think it was probably around like 7 or 8 US dollars for like the most beautiful steak and red wine for a meal. And going, I'd be spending so much more in the States. I feel, like a living it up for the first time on this adventure. I really enjoyed my time in Kenya because it was so different from anything I had ever experienced before. I had my sister come and join me for part of the time that I was there, and that was really special to have been traveling solo for months by that point, and to have a friendly face again. And in that time, we also had a contact that we were put in touch with, a wonderful guy named Kangethe, whose family, the Karaukis, ended up hosting us while we were there. And they ran a school called the Aloe Vera School, which provided free education for kids. And they were just the most welcoming people who just gave us so much kind of warmth and love and care, but were also equally fascinated by us in that time in Kenya and traveling around. We were in Eldoret and in different parts, not just in Nairobi. And we had hiked up a part of Mount Kenya, and we had been in the Maasai reserves, and we would stop through these kind of tiny towns, and people would bring out their babies, their kids, to see the Mzungus, the white people, because they hadn't seen them and they wanted to touch our hair and wanted to like explore what we were. And I think there was something very unique to me about being in a position where I grew up being quite common and to suddenly be viewed as something very other, but in a way that was, came with fascination. And for me, a big part of circumnavigation is the chance to embrace other cultures and really immerse oneself. And that time was a true example of that. We, in that time in Kenya, we also got the chance to actually butcher a chicken, which I had never done before. And so we killed a cuckoo, as they're called in Swahili. And so just learning that process of how to actually purchase a chicken and be able to, chop its head off, drain the blood, be able to pluck all its feathers, to, be able to take everything out of it and clean it and cut it up and cook it, and every part of it being used was just a fascinating experience. And then, of course, they marveled at the idea that I had never done that before, and my sister had never done that before. And they asked us where we got our chicken from. And suddenly you go, oh, I go to the grocery store where it's like prepackaged and wrapped up and in a fridge somewhere. And to them, that wasn't fresh. And going, actually, right. Yeah, we're eating days old chicken that's been sitting packaged up and cleaned. And we're thinking of this as being quite, I don't know, progressive and civilized. And here, there was such sustainability that was just intrinsic to how they ate their food for this challenge. But when I first got to South Africa, I think I was quite naive to some of the cultural differences. And as quite a strong feminist and a forward thinking, very sort of liberal white woman, I had gone from the US, made my first stop in the UK, where I was able to walk around and do what I needed to do and not question anything. coming to South Africa, I was keen to explore and I wanted to see all the different places. And as a solo traveler by myself, I was in Cape Town and I went down to like the pier uh, and to go and explore a bit there. And it started getting darker and it was late. And suddenly it was that thing as a traveler that you sort of spidey sense that happens where you suddenly go, ooh, this isn't good anymore. This isn't right. And I was looking around and suddenly I was genuinely the only person that was, the white person that was out and about walking by myself, which I, as I was quite culturally unaware at that time, where I didn't realize that I should be able to walk around where I need to walk. But that wasn't me understanding the culture and being respectful of how a different place works and learning their rules. And I found myself feeling quite defiant about that. I started to walk my way back to the hostel and I had people sort of like, catcalling stuff at me and started becoming quite, yeah, sort of aggressive more verbally than anything. I think they were just sort of, yeah, testing some of the waters a bit. And um, having grown up in a city, I had city smarts and a good head on my shoulder. So I knew exactly where I was going to get myself back and walking with purpose and all these things that you just don't want to be in a situation where that's the tactic you need to take. And of course, I got back to the hostel and the woman at the reception of the hostel was like, wait, where did you just come from? And couldn't believe that I had been out by myself in that area and was like, don't ever do that again. Don't go there on your own. There's huge amounts of violence and yeah, the kind of behavior I was just really unaware of, and my naivete to having a more I don't know, just a consciousness of other, that when we come into other cultures, it's also our responsibility to learn more about how those cultures work. And it's not to shoehorn our way in with going, these are our, American values and how we do things, but instead going, how do I need to adapt to what these standards are? And sometimes it felt a bit repressive of going into a community where I didn't have the same freedoms that I had in my own community. Makes you grateful for the freedoms that we do have and the progress that we have made, but also an awareness that not every country operates the same way. So we need to be much more aware as travelers. So I found that to be a big challenge. Incredible best friends that are part of that magic that happens when you're traveling, where you have the time of your life and you are best friends with this person that you've just met for the first time. And then you hop on a plane and you leave the next day and you never see them again. And I think that's one of the magical, ephemeral things about these trips around the world, is that you become so porous and open to being submerged into all of these new experiences that you meet so many incredible people who teach you so much. And those moments are so valid and so refreshing and fulfilling, but also they come and then they go and you move on to the next thing. So when I reflect upon the different friendships I made on my trip around the world, I made so many best friends for 24 hours and it was great. And some that I'm still in touch with too. I've got another friend, Anna Linda, who I met in South Africa, and we still keep in touch on Facebook and the karaoke's. We keep in touch on social media as well, and social media has been an amazing thing for these continuation of relationships, especially because in 2004, when I traveled around the world, I didn't have a cell phone, and people didn't have access to the internet the way we do now. And I had a notebook where I wrote things down by hand. I didn't even have a laptop with me. So keeping in touch with people, I imagine by today's standards for foundation scholars that are going around the world now, will be having such a different experience in terms of how those connections and relationships continue to evolve. I suppose the very nuts and bolts takeaway for solo travel that I learned for myself was that I always made sure that I booked my hostel for the very first night so that I always knew exactly where I was going when I got off a plane and then could make decisions from there as to where I might want to move to or go to next. But with the amount of travel we were doing and the jet lag, the knowing where I was going when I first got there became an incredible anchoring when showing up in a new place. The second thing would be walking. I learned so much about places by actually just being on my own 2 feet and wandering from location to location. I knew where I needed to go for meetings I had set up in connection to my research, but it also meant that I took the time to walk and look inside shop windows and stop off at different cafes and talk to everybody. In some places where it was culturally appropriate and welcomed, I learned so much from locals. So that was really a wonderful takeaway. I think in terms of the more um, cerebral parts of that experience, I think solo travel has the opportunity to be very lonely if but it also has the opportunity to be incredibly freeing. And by being only one, it meant that I could get into that sold out concert because they'd had one extra spot, or I could tag along with a group of new people that I met because it was just one that was there. And I could take that one last bed that was going to be in that spot. And also being very approachable as one. I was able to chat with people on ferry boats that otherwise, if I was with another person, probably wouldn't have come over and had a chat with me. So those kind of cultural experiences were enhanced by being one. I really enjoyed being able to journal in my time traveling. I think there was something special about actually writing down what my experiences were and having to process that through taking the time to actually transfer it down onto paper. Uh, and and certainly learned through my experience as well that having traveled around the world, it feels so simple now to say this, but it was really enlightening to be reminded that your way is not always the right way or the only way. And I think growing up within the US and experiencing different cultures across our own country in the US, I had taken that as sort of a norm and a standard that I was comparing other places and my experiences to, but actually becoming a little bit more intersectional and having the opportunity to recognize that the different cultures and that emerged out of these different countries had their own normal. And it was very really important when thinking about social change to know that what works in one place won't work in another. The Chicago chapter of the Circumnavigators Club has been just the most supportive, kind people. After doing my circumnavigation, I continued to stay in touch with the chapter and be part of different events. And the incredible Carol Narup and Father Jim Aramond were just the most supportive people and really encouraging, and came to all my theater shows and things I was doing in Chicago even after our time together. So that was a really special opportunity to feel almost more like family than just people who were mentors to me at that time of developing my trip around the world. So my topic was looking at theater for social change and how it was addressing problems that existed in different countries around the world. And so I was really trying to understand if theater could genuinely create change. Because it's not a one size fits all model, if all these different problems that existed in different countries were specific to those cultures and community, what is it about theater that made it effective or not effective as a tool to actually create discourse and discussion and in the end result in a positive outcome, a positive change to those problems? And being able to take a global perspective on that issue was absolutely incredible, because it allowed me to hold up the research to different cultures and communities that wasn't as simple as a kind of black and white series of check boxes. It was more nuanced than that, which I think is really tricky when talking about theater as a research topic anyway, because it's not just about going, yes, that was effective. It's going, well, did it make us feel things? And how do we actually like quantify that? And did it make us question our ideas? Did we recognize ourselves in the story? Are we more empathetic about something? Did we go away and want to know more about a topic or idea after seeing this show? So the unpacking that research was really dense and layered and nuanced. And getting to go from country to country, it wasn't enough to say, oh, this is the problem facing this country, and this is how theater is going to fix it. It was about equally understanding the country and the culture and the politics and the family dynamics and the way people use gestures to communicate things, or the phrases that they use to say something. I always sort of marvel at a perfect example in the UK about how the gesture of making someone a cup of tea can say so many things. I think as an American, this idea of someone bringing someone tea would just be I'm thirsty, I'll have a cup of tea, thank you for my tea, and it ends there. Whereas a cup of tea can be a way of saying, I love you to somebody. It can be a nurturing thing. It can also be a way of saying, I'm sorry. You can get into a fight with someone, and at the end of the fight, someone will say, you want a cup of tea? And so that kind of understanding of a culture, to actually understand ways that there's storytelling in our actions. And I think a big part of theater is finding ways. My final academic year after I came back from the Circumnavigator Award travel very much guided a lot of my studies in that senior year at Northwestern University. My thesis ended up being a solo show called Time for Takeoff, which was about my journey around the world exploring this very topic. And the idea for me within my research was that the work I was doing on that trip around the world, interviewing people, seeing shows, immersing myself in communities, was then able to be put into practice through the delivery of the presentation of a show that was about this very idea. I was then creating discourse. I was bringing light to issues and concerns that existed in different cultures and communities. I was telling the stories of people that didn't have a platform to tell their own stories. And all of those components of what I was learning were then being displayed in this production. And the production was really special in so many ways, because I got a chance to collaborate and team up with other artists that I had been working with in my 4 years at Northwestern University. So it became this really lovely kind of culminating swan song of my time in college. But also it gave me a chance to perform it for the Chicago Circumnavigator chapter. And that was really special, because I think for many circumnavigators, it's such a unique experience that it's a sort of unspoken understanding of what it means to travel around the world. And so when you meet other circumnavigators, there's this instant kinship that develops. And because I was sharing a show about this experience to a room full of other people that first and foremost had granted me the opportunity to have this experience, but also they knew what it meant to circumnavigate the world and are people who are already invested in travel. The show was incredibly impactful and emotional in a way that was unlike some of the other spaces I performed it. It was impactful to audiences, but it had just this extra magic layer of what it meant to perform for a room of other people who have traveled around the world and understood on another level what these stories meant, because they had experienced it in their own way as well. Yeah, and the show was really special for me to basically be able to walk out of my experience in college with a degree and also with a product. I then had this show that I could take places and do things with, in addition to obviously all my learning. So it set me up in a really nice way to go out into the world and be able to perform, and not just be looking for jobs, but actually be able to bring something places. Currently, I'm a theater artist and maker. I do a lot of something called devising, which is collaborative creative work, where I go into rooms with other creative people and we make original material. And we look at creating plays and shows that aren't necessarily traditionally just done in a theater where audiences sit and watch. I do a lot of work with multidisciplinary creation. So there's often music and movement, and there might be puppetry and shadows, and in unusual spaces inside hallways or in forests, or starting to kind of play and pull with what our understanding is of taking in theater. The circumnavigator experience was without doubt a launching pad for so much of what I do now. After completing the circumnavigation, doing my thesis, graduating from Northwestern, I went and studied with the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London, getting my acting certificate there, which was a very international group of other performers, meeting more people around the world. I began to create lots of original work, joining different companies in Chicago, from the Factory Theater to Adventure Stage Chicago, where I got the chance to direct shows and perform in shows and tour shows to different places, and received a Fulbright award to go back to the UK to study devising, so to study collaborative creation work in theater. And while I was there, I got one of the open grants as a Fulbrighter. So I, instead of working just through a university, I got the chance to actually craft my own program, which meant I got to work with professional companies all across England and Scotland, where I was in the room making work with the professionals that I would have otherwise have been studying about in a university setting. So they became my collaborators and friends, to the point that I then ended up applying for my artist visa to return to Scotland, where I was doing work with the National Theatre of Scotland. I was creating work with the Scottish Youth Theatre. I was making my own work that was then touring, and being given a platform to allow myself a chance to work more internationally by being based over in the UK and closer to all of the goings on in Europe, as well as coming back to the US and creating work there. So it just opened up my whole world. And since then, I've done loads of international collaborations. And even as we speak right now, I'm here in Dubai, of all places, gearing up for Expo 2020. So the World Expo that's happening, and working with all the incredible presentations and arts and culture that's happening here at another world's stage. So yeah, the Circumnavigator Award was genuinely a really important seed that blossomed in my life, and is certainly something I think back on fondly, but also can completely see the direct connections to everything that I do now as an artist who works in places all around the world, doing theater that makes meaning for people and hopefully makes the world a bit better than I found. Being able to travel around the world definitely impacted my understanding of living in a different country. I think the idea of traveling to another place and seeing how another culture lived and worked in some ways seemed very mystifying and traveling to places where I had purpose in that travel. I wasn't just going to these places on vacation. I was going to these places with the intent of research, with the intent of finding research that was going to filter into the work I was doing back in the States. And because of that experience, it meant that I wasn't just in a hotel and tourist attractions. I was seeing the way people were actually living, and I was living alongside them and learning from them and speaking to them. So it pulled back the curtain on some of that mystification of living in other places. And it made me really value what it means to be other in a place. I've always been very proud to be an American, and am so grateful to have grown up in America. And by being an American in the UK and in Scotland specifically, where my home base is now located, I bring something different to the table. I am different. I have a unique perspective. I have a unique set of training and background that is not the same as the other Scottish people that might be in that room, or other international people that might be in that room. And as someone who does devising work, where the real gift in working in collaboration is that there's diversity, and that means you create a show that is specific to the skill sets of what's in that room. So I've always viewed my otherness as a real opportunity, and something that makes the work I do even stronger, and the work we collectively do as a team even stronger, because we're celebrating those unique differences. And the circumnavigation opportunity definitely helped me to see that that could be a possible way of living. It wasn't just a dream, it could be my life. My words of advice to an upcoming circumnavigator scholar is to just say yes and to every moment. I think the opportunity to travel around the world is so unique, and everything is ephemeral. Things kind of come and go, and so seizing the moment is really important. Getting to, be in these places, things will come and go. And so if you don't grab the bull by the horns and try something out, you might not make other new discoveries. I'm a big believer in serendipity, and have done a lot of studies on serendipity, especially in the creative practice. And I've even done a TEDx talk on this very topic, because I find it to be such an important way of living one's life, sort of being open to the happy accidents that come our way, and being able to see when those opportunities come along is a skill that can get developed more and more over time. And I think people who travel are often already predisposed to that. So being in the moment and saying, yes, I'm going to try stuff, and being also open to knowing that your way is not the only way, I think is a really important part of preparing for said trip, but also to fully engage with the trip when you're there. Try all the different foods. Go walk everywhere on your own 2 feet. Don't just hop into taxis. Talk to everyone who will talk to you. See all the sights that you want to see. Look for the things that no one else is looking for. And just have so much fun. And send pictures, because I want to enjoy them. My pitch about the Circumnavigators Club would probably start with a question, which is, are you ready for your life to be changed forever? Because if you are, this opportunity will do just that. This is a chance to go completely around the world by yourself, studying a topic that you are passionate about, that you will be able to get a global perspective on. It's a chance to have support and mentorship from seasoned travelers who are also circumnavigators who really understand the complexities of this kind of travel, but the opportunity that comes with this kind of travel. And you will get the chance to learn so much about your topic, but even more about yourself. The 50th anniversary of a grant like this is so remarkable to think that for the past 50 years, people have been sent around the world getting to pursue a topic that they are passionate about. Um, I think this is no small feat, and it's an incredible accomplishment that it's existed for as long as it has. And I hope that it continues to go on for years and years and years, especially as we become more of a global society at large. Travel outside of pandemic times has gotten easier in so many ways. We're so much more connected and interconnected, and the sharing of information is so much more swift than it was even when I did it in 2004 in ways that I still marvel at. So I feel nothing but a huge congratulations to every person that has been part of making this happen. Feel lucky to have been a recipient of it, and I'm so thrilled at the idea that it could happen for many, many more years in the future.